Welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. We are your hosts, Dr. Scott Hoye, clinical psychologist,
and Kyle Miller, licensed counselor. Psychology Talk is a unique conversation about psychology around the globe. We speak with psychology experts to keep you informed about current issues and trends. We advocate toward reducing stigma and educate about mental health.
While you're listening, please take a moment to give us a review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, or your favorite streaming service. It helps us to continue providing you with quality programming. And now, enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Psychology Talk podcast. Today, my guest is Mark O'Connell. Mark is a licensed clinical social worker and an actor. He holds degrees in social work from Hunter College in New York City, as well as an MFA in acting from the Trinity Rep Conservatory. Mark is the author of Modern Brides and Modern Grooms. He is also the author of The Performing Art of Therapy, available from Routledge Press. Today, we will be discussing that book and one of my favorite subjects, the overlap between psychotherapy skills and acting skills. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, maybe you can tell us a little about yourself and your background, which is pretty darn interesting, and how these two kind of things overlapped in your journey in both fields.
Well, it's funny. When I was a teenager, I actually told people that I was going to be an actor who became a therapist. So I kind of always, somewhere in my mind, knew that was going to be the
really
something. Yeah, it's inexplicable. I think I was always just a listener. Mm-hmm. I was just that person who listened and was just interested in what made people tick, and it's the connection between those two art forms has always been intuitive to me and very interesting to me. So, so I started acting first, and then in college and graduate school, and then I pursued it as a profession, and then I actually started a theater company because I wasn't getting the work that I wanted, and I felt pigeonholed, and I wanted to explore more of who I was and invite other artists to have that opportunity. And then I realized, okay, it's time to become a therapist, because that's what therapy is. You know, you invite people in to the rehearsal studio to become, the various versions of who they really are. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I went to social work school, kind of a nice segue from that experience. And then I found that I use my acting experience more than anything else now as a therapist.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about that overlap. And we have similar backgrounds, and I could probably start talking about things, but I'd rather you kind of.
I'm interested in what your overlaps are.
I basically was acting for a long time. My undergraduate, I moseyed into acting, and my undergraduate was a BFA in printmaking and art history, and I got really sick of just being in studios all the time and working alone. And I was also starting I was in a couple different bands, a prog rock band and a Celtic band. And I just kind of moseyed into acting. And then I went, wow, this is really cool. And so I did a lot of work in the Detroit area, moved to New York and did some work, took some more classes with guys like Tim Phillips, Gene Frankel. I was at his studio for a while. Tom Noonan, briefly at his studio. And around the same time, I was also exploring Michael Chekhov's work. Mm. And I had been doing some of my own personal research in things like psychology and hypnosis. And I was seeing there's a ton of overlap with Chekhov's work. You even point that out in your book. And so what I did is I started to study hypnosis and started doing that as a kind of side gig, a private practice as a lay hypnotist. And I realized there were very limited things I could do with it. And the more I started to delve into the literature of psychology and psychiatry, specifically Milton Erickson's work, mm-hmm. The more I said, this really feels like a calling to me. And so I went to grad school, and here I am today in a private practice. So kind of a long, circuitous route, but more like it was a fun journey. Learning a lot, learning about myself along the way, and then seeing that overlap. I still see that overlap between the performing art of acting and what you call the performing art of therapy, and that in the book specifically, what resonated with me is that you're structuring in both areas. You're structuring a relational event.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
They're both relational events. Anyway, enough of me.
That's fascinating, and that's a great way of thinking about your journey. Really, moving out of the studio into even just like music performance and that reciprocity between
correct.
Between people, really, through music or through even hypnotherapy sounds like it has a real performative relational potential as well.
It does. I think, it's really like the basis of relational therapies. Freud and Breuer got there from history. That's where they kind of came up with the ideas of analysis. If you go back to it. So a lot of the same concepts pretty much overlap, and really, I think all of the psychotherapies kind of have the same story, the same background. You're looking for the same thing. You just give them different terms, right?
Well, that's just it. And for me, thinking about the work like an actor thinks about their work, I think really ends the therapy wars, really, because no matter what theories or techniques guide your work, just like an actor might have trained in Meisner or practical aesthetics or the method or viewpoints, and that may frame what they do and help them in some way that's very specific to them. But at the end of the day, even the most trained actor like Viola Davis, you don't get more trained and expert than she is, will say, I don't have a method because I have to be naive each time, because this person I'm assigned to I've never met them before. I don't know what it's like to be in their skin. So each and every time, that what's similar about both acting and therapy is that you're starting from scratch every time. That's part of the art and the practice.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we have wonderful techniques and theories. They help us communicate with each other about what it is we do. It maintains responsibility, about what we do to a certain extent, and a framework. But there's always a toggle. You have to toggle back and forth between talking about what you're doing and understanding it in that intellectual sense, and then being in it in order to really reach the client or the character. And so, I think there's a way in which I want to emphasize to people most of all is that really thinking like an actor helps you to not kind of be in this debate with other therapists about what the work is. And the goals are the same. At the core, the goal of acting and therapy is the same. It's to invite another person, whether it's a character, a client, a scene partner, invite another person to embody a range of their humanity, of who they are. Mm-hmm. And the means to achieve that goal at the core are the same, which is just to listen, and not listen passively, to listen with potential, with an invitation for the person to participate. So, it doesn't matter what guides your work. That's what you're doing, no matter what kind of therapist you are.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And you did mention the psychotherapy debates. Now, when I went to school, I went to the Adler University, used to be called the Adler School of Professional Psychology. So I was offered Adler's therapy, based on what we can discern from how he thought we think he did therapy.
First, I thought you were talking Stella Adler.
Oh yeah, no, I was going to make a joke the other day with Seth Michael May when I had him on the podcast. Oh, you studied under Stella Adler. I studied under Alfred Adler. Yeah. No, all these Adlers floating around. Pretty common name, I think, in Germany. Yeah, I studied that, but and there wasn't much making of hay of as much as in some schools where I've taught at, where they want the students to debate the merits of their particular school or theory of personality and therapy that they're studying intensely, and so they kind of foster the debate. A lot. I think there's this in academics. They, especially research oriented. It's really easy to in CBT to take those concepts and operationalize them and turn them into quick outcome studies with Likert scales and stuff. Which I think you can use Likert scales in a psychodynamic approach, and I think you can insert CBT in it, and I think you could do some Adlerian stuff. I still do lifestyle assessments in a first session that kind of figure out how people conceptualize their origin story. And, it's all kind of back and forth. But if I'm not present there, if I'm just hanging out, if I'm just kind of, I guess, riffing on these particular techniques or stuck in the technique, I'm not being present.
Well, and what's interesting about that, when you mention CBT, is that Judith Beck, for example, daughter of Aaron Beck, who founded CBT, she has in at least 2 of her books, she describes what the most effective aspect of the therapeutic engagement is, which is the idiosyncratic listening, the way the therapist listens with their eyes, with their voice, the way that you engage the client. She emphasizes as actually the most important element, and then she even, what a screen actor would call subtext, she gives suggestions for subtext that you could have to warm up that relationship and make it stronger.
Have you watched? Have you ever seen her perform? Have you ever seen her with a patient?
No, I haven't.
As an example, go and look for some videos of her. APA has some outstanding videos of her doing work with a client, a patient, and I swear to God, I was waiting for her to pull out a mood log or do some Socratic dialogue or look for downward arrow or whatever process, right? And you would think she's a relationally like a client centered or a psychodynamically based therapist. She comes across as this caring mother figure.
That's not surprising when you read the writing.
Actually read between the lines, right? Yeah. Even Aaron Beck has a very, he just passed away, but he has had a very relational connection with people. Right?
And the thing that also solves this for us, if you look at the past 2 years, when it's sort of like you're in your sweatpants, like starting March 2020, like on your computer, who's going to debate what works better at that point? And I tell people this specific story that of being in my sweatpants, the cat's on the computer, my 2-year-old's railing against his nap in the other room. I have to move to the basement. It's freezing down there. I've already disrupted this session, so I don't want to go back up and get a sweater. There's a Halloween costume on the floor. I put that on. And this client, who tends to be very reserved, at the end of the session does not fire me, but instead says, thank you for being genuine at this, difficult time for everyone. And so there's no method there more than, as you just said, being present with this person and going back to that core goal, which is, again, the core goal of acting. How do I invite this person to embody as much of who they are in this moment? And then you use what you have to do that.
It's almost like, I don't know if you've mentioned it in the book. I've read the book, but I don't know if you mentioned this concept. But one of the concepts that came to mind while I was reading the book is the idea of breaking the fourth wall. Is it okay to do that in therapy? Is there a fourth wall in therapy? Is it somehow we can kind of cling tenaciously to a goal that the theory we resonate with or espouse, is that getting in the way of the relationship? And do you have
the way I think about that is, again, always as I'm usually thinking similar to how I would think as an actor. I think in terms of boundaries, but I think of boundaries as being so incredibly case by case and dynamic, and you're kind of forming a contract of what boundaries are moment to moment. And so the main goal is everyone needs to be safe. Whether that's you're doing fight choreography or sex choreography as an actor, or something even more simple than that. You have to feel emotionally safe in order to go to all the freeing places you need to go to. And that's the same thing for therapy. So, you're always determining what it is going to require to feel safe. Some people may need a little more of you, and you really determine that. And if you feel, for whatever reason, exploited by that, distracted by that, then you have to determine how much of yourself you want to reveal. But I always think of it in terms of what boundaries do we need and how much freedom do we need in order for everyone to feel safe to do the work. That's how I would think about that.
Yeah. So that's one way of thinking about breaking the fourth wall. But maybe another idea would be to say that the fourth wall is put up because you're kind of coasting along in therapy, and you're so kind of on autopilot, which of course the book isn't about being on autopilot in therapy, but it happens to us. So we don't catch some things, or we don't we forget. We kind of step back into a character, so to speak, of the therapist, which a lot of people, I think, especially when we first start this thing, this strange business of psychotherapy or psychology or social work or whatnot, we kind of step into that role first, and then we figure out who we are in that role, being present. Maybe that's not breaking fourth wall per se, but it's stepping out of roles and into being able to play different roles as a therapist.
Yes.
Or as a patient, even helping them be more flexible.
Yeah. And it's interesting what you said about when you're kind of finding yourself coasting or something like that. I find that there's always a reason for that. And that's why, again, I'm just so repetitive about this. I'm most informed just like by acting. I always ask myself, what would I do as an actor? And in therapy, you have this luxury of an endless rehearsal process. If the insurance doesn't mess that up for people, you ideally have this endless rehearsal where you can be available for a scene partner who isn't ready to say yes and yet, who is just kind of, isn't totally showing up. And that's when I tend to tune or just coast is really when I ask myself, why am I coasting? It's because the person isn't ready yet usually to tap into a feeling, anger, or something that might feel threatening in a relationship. But what's great is you have time to, when I recognize that that's what's going on, then I'll think of it in terms of, okay, so how do I, as a scene partner, wait for them, convey with all my being an invitation for them to, you mentioned Michael Chekhov, to eventually show that psychological gesture of who they really are, or what Winnicott would call the spontaneous gesture.
Right.
Yeah. And I'll wait. And sometimes for years, I have a client who we've been working together for years, and it's been, I don't know if I've said 5 words in the past 3 or 4 years, but now they're starting to show up, and they're not as kind of reactive when I participate with them, and they're ready to embody more of themselves and to kind of mix it up a little bit. And so, there's usually a reason why we're coasting. So sometimes it's worth waiting. Sometimes it's worth being provocative and breaking the fourth wall, as you say, and doing something spontaneous to,
Yeah, maybe we can talk a bit about the book itself now. The book's, it divided into 3 sections, I think pretty well done, or acts, right? Preparing, rehearsing, and performing. And it's such a nice conversational style. It's inviting. I don't think it's at all off-putting, or it's very much an open and warm kind of.
Thank you.
You could kind of pick it up and glean something from it. And if you have it, as a therapist could have it lying around in their office, wink, wink, nudge, nudge to therapists out there. And you could just kind of between sessions, if you have some time, you want to read a nice passage, there's some cool ideas in it. And so it's very informal, I think. And it's a nice spacious kind of place to hang out in with you as the author.
Oh, yeah. I like that. Thank you.
But maybe you could kind of go over those sections a little bit and kind of describe your thoughts about it.
It's a tricky thing when you're writing about any kind of organic art form, really, because in terms of structure, you want to have a structure that at least, you don't want it to be too schematic. Yeah. But I chose those three. I thought that was the best way to at least have some organization to this organic sprawling process. Mm-hmm. And I think the bulk of what we do is rehearsal. Really, like I said, you're trying and failing most of the time, and just kind of figuring out. It's like this long rehearsal process you would never be allowed as an actor. So it's freeing in that sense. But in that section, I talk a lot about preparation. I think thinking like an actor helps me get ahead of the challenges that we face as therapists. In some ways, the not knowing is always part of it. But I think therapists, you find it in our writing a lot, this experience of getting blindsided by things. And of course, we can't be prepared for everything. I'm not suggesting that there's a way to be invincible, that there's a way to not be vulnerable and to not be thrown. We have to be thrown. But there's a way to prepare yourself to be thrown. And that's what actors do. And so breath, you supporting yourself with breath. First and foremost, really just recognizing what you're working with. I mean, I tend toward, to be a little high strung in my everyday self. I tend to be a little anxious, and I've learned to not try to overcorrect that, but just to work with it. How can I take a deeper breath? How can I recognize what's keeping my ribs tense or something and affecting my being? So when you're able to use I suggest a meditation exercise to get to know the different energy centers in your body, so you can recognize, wait a minute, what I call me is just these habits of my everyday life, and they're there for lots of reasons. But hey, wait a minute. When I'm centered down here, I talk like this and I feel like this, and this is also me. Wait a minute, this is me. This is not some caricature of someone else. So you learn, and when you're prepared to use yourself in that with that versatility, then when it's pulled out of you by surprise, you're not quite as surprised, and you're capable of kind of going there where the person is sort of pulling you in a way that I think sometimes we're not always prepared to go there, and we kind of get used up rather than using ourselves to engage, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So staying grounded, being a secure base, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also even just down to sitting, I teach workshops, like acting workshops for therapists, and sitting is the first thing. I mean, we just have to not get sciatica, just to break it down for us all. You Google sitting is the new smoking, It's terrible.
It is. Yes. I as my lower back raises its right hand and says yes.
Yes. And so to me, that's thinking like an actor too. You're preparing your instrument to engage and to be able to be as full of life as possible within the limitations that are necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. One of the things you mentioned, I think was very helpful, because I've had on internship, I had my supervisor make this indication. He says, you've really done a good job, Scott, of being a blank slate, but you're working in a MESA unit, a mentally ill substance abusers unit. And your patients on your caseload right now, a lot of them have thought disorders, and it sounds like they're a little bit unnerved by you just kind of being a blank slate. Did you ever think about like how you're, maybe you could like move your eyes a little bit more and like more pantomime, gestures with them, physical, facial gestures. And you mentioned, like, I think sometimes we do kind of forget how we come across visually. And you even mentioned like maybe videotape a session or videotape role playing or you being on a computer screen now in this virtual therapy realm we're in, to be more self-aware, not narcissistically self-aware or too self-conscious and critical, but to be able to give yourself constructive criticism. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. And it's a tricky thing, like you said. I mean, Helen Mirren in her master acting class says, do never act in front of a mirror because it's the opposite of what your job is. She says your job is to use your imagination and to be connected to your inner life. So, and I agree with her, but I also disagree with her. She may be very comfortable in understanding how her instrument works, but I think certainly a lot of therapists, we don't know how our instrument works, and we kind of assume that we're invisible. We go into this analytic daydream sometimes, or we don't necessarily know how our thoughts and feelings are manifesting in our faces, our eyes, at all times. It all is being read, and a screen actor knows that. Yep. So I suggest sometimes people just take a look at yourself in the mirror, videotape yourself, or even just look at yourself, on the screen that shows your face during a session. That's not going to distract you from listening. If you're actually listening, it can actually only, in some ways, deepen your listening, because you can see what's happening to your own face as you're listening, and at least take responsibility for how your inner life, to Helen Mirren's point, is actually affecting your instrument and how you're using it. So that's what I would say is self-awareness and not self-consciousness.
Right, which is part of that preparation process, I think. And I think you also mentioned, too, you talk about the idea of projection. I think you mentioned Andre Gregory watching a performance of
Julianne
Moore. And Andre Gregory, for those of you who don't know, is a very big name in New York theater, and also you've probably seen him if you ever watched My Dinner with Andre, which is a great play and a great movie. Talk about projection going on from the audience there, right? But I think people in therapy obviously do that, and we do project a lot of the performance onto what we're seeing based on our own, what I think Noam Chomsky would call a transderivational search. We go inside and trying to relate to what the story is that's being told to us or shown to us in a play or a movie, or radio drama, and we project our stuff onto it and kind of embody the characters or take on their life. But also, our patients do that with us, and I think to a certain extent we do that in what's called countertransference, right? Transference, countertransference. Talk a little bit about that. I think that
it's interesting. Along the lines of what you were saying about the audience embodying the character, Marlon Brando said, and I think I put this in the book too. He said that the audience will do most of the acting themselves. And that bit about Julianne Moore, she was doing something. She was just very, very present on stage. She wasn't really saying anything. And he asked her afterward, Andre Gregory asked her after the performance, "What were you doing?" And she said, I was counting to 10, and and it reminds you about projection. It reminds you about how much you're doing just by thinking.
Yeah.
So it can, whether it's about scaling back how much you think you need to do or how much you think you need to, do with your face or your tools of engagement, or just trusting that, trusting that you're doing enough, or recognizing, you know what, I could do a little bit more to, it's again, mostly about being present with the scene partner. And so the more self-aware, that is also what I suggest as part of our process. The more aware we are of how we use ourselves, the more capable we are, I think, of dealing with those projections. Not internalizing them, not getting trapped and kind of stuck in this sense of, oh gosh, this client thinks that I'm sadistic. Because I enforced my cancellation policy, and and now I feel sadistic. So it's pulling out this part of me that actually feels selfish. And what's wonderful about that is that that's how acting works. Your scene partner, in the way that they treat you, activates this part of you that's authentic to a certain extent, or at least potentially authentic, and but you don't have to internalize that, and you shouldn't. So a lot of getting to know yourself, getting to know your own reactions and how that they manifest, helps you to be where you are when you're cast in a certain role, but then also recognize that's not the end of the story. This is something to work with, but I don't have to get stuck here. So I think it can help in that sense, thinking that way.
Yeah. I think also we tend to disregard how much patients actually are watching us and picking up on what we pick up on. And if you've been with a patient long enough, and you know like some of their unconscious movements, and like they might say things like, "I hate it when you pick up on that." And then you say, what's going on internally? But they're very aware of how much we're picking up from them. And in many ways, it is like having longer term patients, especially. It can be like having some of the best scene partners, if you think of it that way, ever. Yeah, but the back and forth. So embodiment, we kind of covered embodiment. And you do have several exercises in there that you might be able to address. You mentioned breathing, but what are some of the other meditative exercises that you might use or teach others to use to kind of just stay in the moment and focused?
Well, really, anything that you do, any kind of time-limited exercise, I, for one, run as much as I can. So if you can run, if your knees and your body allows yourself to run, I suggest that everybody run, or go for a brisk walk, or yoga if you can. But what's great about that is there's an end, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, just like a session or a scene. And so what I notice as far as meditation goes during an exercise like that, I always notice all the negative things that happen in my body, all the stress initially. So I want to get to the finish line right away. If I were an actor, it's like I want to get to the end of the scene. I want to be clear. I want to get applause. I want to nail it. And so I notice that about myself. And then what I try to do is not put a podcast on and try to ignore that. I try to be exactly where I am. I try to breathe into that vulnerability. And specifically, that usually means opening up the lower ribs. It means letting go of shoulders and neck, where our ego really manifests in the shoulders and neck a lot in terms of trying to force something. So I'll notice, okay, all right, I'm just going to breathe into that. I'm going to notice that it feels terribly uncomfortable, and that I don't want to do it. But with each new breath, I recognize I'm not just feeling vulnerability. Wait a minute. I'm also being able to recognize, a happy children and a happy dog that's running in the park with me. And I have a mix of feelings, and I'm able to move through them and not get stuck in any one of them. And I'm also able to live in each moment rather than push to the end. And what inspires me, I always tell clients this too. What inspires me to be as vulnerable as possible when I take those breaths is actors. Some of the most effective scenes are those pivotal moments when an actor is so willing to embody vulnerability in order to alter the character's story. If you think Viola Davis in Fences, when her big speech to her husband, she's as vulnerable as can be. But for the first time, she's able to change the course of that relationship because she finds this incredible strength. I love those moments. You know, Leonardo DiCaprio in Romeo and Juliet, when he recognizes, wait a minute, my best friend was just killed. You know, he's devastated, and he's like, you know what? And I need to be a grown up now. I'm no longer a boy in love. I need to be, you know, and you can hear it in the actor's voice. Actors live for that. And I think, so I try to encourage people to live for that, because actors inspire us and show us that you don't get swallowed up by your vulnerability. It's there to be used to stay present. And so that kind of imagery helps me when I'm in the middle of a run and trying to breathe deeply and stay in there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, what about the rehearsal section of your book? Maybe you can talk to some of the concepts there.
Right. So I was talking about preparation, and now we're talking rehearsal. Play is really the thing. I mean, framing,
keeping the ball in the air, as you say, right?
Keeping the ball in the air. Framework, I guess. First, you always want to have safety. You can't really throw the ball in the air until you know that someone's going to catch it, and you know that you're safe enough to go back and forth. So you establish whatever safety is necessary. And now here's the thing: some therapists, and even, you know, swear by certain rules, like I will never shake a hand. So I put in the book as well that, well, that's not necessarily keeping everyone safe. You know, I had a client that I talk about in the book that really needed a handshake in order to feel present with me. Now, if I had felt like I just uncomfortable in any way giving him the handshake for whatever reason, I wouldn't have done it. Like, we both have to feel safe. But it didn't really cost me anything. And I recognized that when I did, he was there with me. And now I don't usually give handshakes. You know, I usually encourage, I feel like usually that's not the thing that keeps people safe. So anyway, so you case by case attune to what keeps everyone safe. But then you start playing and you see, well, also if not everyone's capable of playing. Right. So you recognize how they're not capable of playing. And again, you use that luxurious long rehearsal process to kind of wait for them. Unlike like the UCB or Second City, you know, like people aren't going to go home if you're just sitting there waiting for the scene partner to show up. but we have that great luxury.
Yeah. So, and maybe that's where a lot of the creativity comes in, figuring out maybe how does this person, what's their particular style of play, what works for them, right?
Right. And to notice how frustrating it can be sometimes. And to notice ourselves saying, wait a minute, this is what play and therapy is supposed to be like. They're supposed to be responsive to this thing that I do. Really just notice those instincts about ourselves. I give an anecdote that I love from Olympia Dukakis, who is talking about working with her husband on Long Day's Journey into Night, and they had done it before, and her brother was directing, and she said to her brother, "Wait a minute, I can't work with him. He's not doing it right." And he was like, her brother was like, "I can't work with you because you're not open to what he is giving you." Anyway, so we can be like that too as therapists. We can. And we actually do it a lot. I have to catch myself continuously. We have an idea.
This person's just being so resistant.
Yeah. And and we
air
cancel
quotes,
them.
Air quotes, resistant. Yeah.
Right. And I actually had a glorious experience just recently. A client came back to me. They don't usually necessarily do that when it goes badly. And we were getting in these enactments. I guess I was feeling like, you're not playing, so you can leave, basically was my attitude. And I thought about that a lot, and I try, the more experienced I am, the older I get, to really be accountable, even to the people who kind of cancel me, if you will. Even if I feel I didn't do anything wrong. I really try to understand, how were they trying to play? How were they trying to show up? And what happened there how was I not letting them do that? So this person came back to me, and I actually had the great good fortune to explain, to share all of that, and we could go over what didn't work. And I could say, look, I'm going to try to give you what you want. I'm going to do it imperfectly, but I'm going to try.
So that's kind of a bit of breaking the fourth wall there, maybe.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, I guess you pick and choose when it's going to be useful.
I think I've been using a lot of an attachment disturbance repair type of therapy model, integrative model, that Dan Brown and his group of colleagues put together out of Harvard. And it's based on attachment theory, but it utilizes imagery, ideal parent imagery. It utilizes mentalization, which is kind of a more cognitive therapy meets psychodynamic therapy. It's out of Tavistock Hospital in London. A lot of Americans don't use it quite yet, but you should look into it. And it also has the third pillar, which is to develop metacognition and step outside of the relationship. So part of the frame of reference is we're going to break the fourth wall, because there's going to be times when we might not understand each other. We have impasses, and we're going to look at it to see what's working and what's not, so we can adjust the therapy. Right. So it allows for that kind of back and forth, and to see what's working and what's not.
Right. And for me, that's always going to come out of attuning to my scene partner. That's always going to be about sort of, wait a minute, we're not safe enough to play. Why not? Let's maybe check in and deconstruct this a little
rather
bit.
Than like sitting in, the role maybe without delineating it to the person you're doing the scene with. Right. As sometimes people, I think the reason that Brown and company decided to have that third pillar was to provide metacognition about relationships, insight, add more insight based on the insight that's going on in this pretend relationship or this healing relationship we have. And also to just not pile on the therapist the reparenting job that so many schools of psychotherapy, I think unfairly, we might take on too much of the role of a secure object, right? And that's why the imagery is there as well.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so it gives them some participation and responsibility in the process.
To kind of look at relationships in general. This is a safe relationship. We can step in and out of it, out of the roles we're playing, figure out what we're doing, look at the transference. Yeah.
Again, safety. Yeah. And I always think I just think in theater terms, or acting terms, you have to toggle back and forth between really staying in there with vulnerability and playing, and then also stepping outside and talking about what are we doing. It's a toggling back and forth, and that's why I find these two art forms to be really, for me, it's the same, but at the very least, very similar.
Yeah, right. You also kind of talk about checking out the dailies. This is kind of a nice way of thinking, nice metaphor. What's that about?
Well, and a colleague of mine, Philip Ringstrom, writes a lot about improv and psychoanalysis as well. And he, he writes about this as well, where, you really have to allow yourself to be immersed in the play and the kind of failing and the not knowing. And then you step outside of that performance and you look back each day, and you say, what did we do? What have I done? My most important question, I think, is what have I done? That is what I find. That's the question I find most valuable, because you can never quite get it right, and you never well, also your behavior. You're operating unconsciously. A lot, which is why these comparisons to these art, to improv and acting is really essential, because you don't quite know what you're up to until after the fact. It happens so quickly. So you want to, looking at the dailies gives you an opportunity to see, oh, that's what was going on with me. And then to maybe make an adjustment, but at the very least kind of understand the dynamic better.
Kind of go back and think about the session, like kind of like in panorama of your day, or a particular, if something keeps coming up for you about a client's
and just like the weirdness of it, like just the weird human interaction. It's very easy to just say, to take the note and give it to an insurance company and say, oh, here's what we did. We went over the treatment plan. We did goal number A, and it's very easy to do that. But then we disavow all of the weird stuff that was actually coming up for us. Well, but that's the stuff. That's the real stuff.
That is the real stuff. But how do you, again, I think the reason why a lot of researchers like those Likert scales and manualized treatments is because someone else can take a look at it and quickly check boxes, and because you check boxes.
Right.
I mean, it's a bit like when you watch a TV show and someone doctored the script and there were boxes that were checked.
Oh, Netflix commits that crime quite a bit. I mean,
it happens all the time. It's just like, oh my Lord, this was so good until they had to throw this character in, or like whatever is in the pop culture milieu.
Totally.
Right. Whether it's
Peter Brook called that the deadly theater. That's you're caving to the expectation of the audience. That's your entire focus, rather than to just exchange attention and see where that can lead.
The beautiful thing, someone said to me years ago, a musician friend of mine, I was asking him why people liked, I don't know, let's say this particular boy band that was out in the 90s. And he said, Scott, think about it. People are just voyeurs. They'll listen to and watch anything. That's the beautiful thing. I mean, and maybe they'll figure out what has more quality to it, or a critic can tell them, or an academic.
Well, that is not true. I am a disappointed streaming customer these days.
But many people will probably beg to differ, or they wouldn't know. Yeah, I mean, you can be very critical if you spend a lot of time looking at scripts and doing classic plays. If you're doing Shakespeare and Moliere or something, and you go back and this is not very good. You can see you can see where somebody needed to check a box and get a paycheck, but
I think people know. I think even I think
good.
They know.
Good. I hope let's say unconsciously they know. Their unconscious knows. Yeah.
Well, even when I tell people about my work, about the workshops I teach in this book. Even just the word acting, even myself, when we think of that word in a small talk sense, we think it means being fake. But I think even if you haven't had all that training you were talking about, I think everyone knows what good acting actually is, and that it's just the person finding truth within themselves. If they see Meryl Streep and Daniel Day-Lewis doing it, Viola Davis, they are, you're watching someone, they know that it's someone embodying that person within themselves truthfully. They know it intuitively, but we've got lodged into the small talk part of our brains that the word means to be fake. And I think that's an example of it. People know quality because quality storytelling is truthful.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very true. That's true. Well, we can come back to this at some other point. The debate about voyeurism, and there's a lot of money out there that's being spent. I was listening to somebody the other day. I think they said that there's more streaming material being produced in 1 year on something like Netflix, new material, than was produced in all of the 90s. And think about that.
Oh.
It's probably. I mean, it's quite possible. I mean, there's a lot of money floating out there too in that sea of entertainment. It's almost as difficult to navigate the sea of entertainment as it is to navigate the internet and keep because it's almost like too much information.
It's too much, yeah. And they get and the productions are in and out like the way the insurance companies want therapy to be. It's just these quick fixes and here you go. It's as ineffective as these short-term therapies that the insurance companies enforce. I would say.
Well, I'll get Dr. David Burns on here and we'll talk about short-term therapy. He's all about like having a quick and down and dirty therapy. But follow-up, real long-term follow-up.
Depends on what your goal is.
Yeah. Well, I do think I do go along with like the meta-analysis of psychotherapy working most of the factor that's involved in the healing is what the client can bring to the therapy.
Yes.
And has very little to do with what we adhere to or have allegiance to as far as a theory. And we just kind of have to be there. The biggest thing is the relationship and what the client can bring and evoking it from them. Yeah. So it's kind of, if that's the case, I think I would argue that outcome studies are kind of backwards.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah, but that's another podcast, maybe. Well, maybe we can touch on the last section, performing, and I noticed that you spoke about rewriting narratives or script.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Also direction, specific actions or performances.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, and when I categorize this section as performance, I don't mean with a capital P, like we're. But there are aspects to our job that are not, let's see how this turns out, like crisis intervention. And there are certain moments, like for an actor, that would be the fight choreography. And I talk about how I injured someone because I messed up one day while I was wielding an axe in a play. Oh. Well, he didn't get hit with the axe, but he did injure his.
That's good. It was not a real axe, I hope.
You know what? In my memory, it was a real axe.
Okay.
Yeah. Which that part, anyway, that is a different conversation. But safety always comes back to safety. But there are moments that we have to get just right, is my point. Or at least close, to how we plan them to be. And, sometimes speaking to parents is like that. Mm-hmm. As far as direction, when I think of myself as a director in the room, I also think of myself as an actor who is a director. So I'm not just directing a scene with when I'm put in that position, I'm also engaging with the scene partners and modeling perhaps in a way how they can think and communicate about the engagement. So the example I give is a father and a son who were not talking to each other, and the son was hinting at suicide, and the father was like hunched over. His posture was really, disengaged, and it was just like subtle adjustments that a director would do, where you're just like, you know what, just slightly turn to him, put your hand on his shoulder, and of course, the kid starts crying. The dad starts coming up with lines of his own that he didn't have before, just from that simple adjustment. And so I don't want to give the wrong idea and suggest that it's just about that little bit of direction, but it's the idea that that you can participate in the way the actors are talking to each other and empower them to communicate with each other. I do want to say one of the directors who inspires me is someone I went to grad school with, whose name is Liesl Tommy, and she was nominated for a Tony for Eclipse. She directed the Aretha Franklin biopic with Jennifer Hudson, and she was trained as an actor, so she directs in this way that empowers actors, and that's what Jennifer Hudson even said. That she's like, oh gosh, she's talking to me in this way that helps me feel like I can participate and come up with my own creativity. So that's how I think of, or like to think of myself when I have to do something that involves some direction. Narrating, it's those are the moments. You might even call it interpretation sometimes, depending on your orientation. Those are the moments when I suggest to a client a way of thinking about their story that might be valuable for them to think about. Someone who says, gosh, I'm terrible to my parents. I want to focus on my grad school, and they keep wanting to visit me, and and I'm just the worst person. And so I give them an alternative way of thinking about it. Like, wow, this is the first time in your life that you've been able to claim something meaningful for yourself. And so you're not disengaging from your parents. In fact, I can hear that in your voice when you talk about your parents. And so that would be an example of narration that is not imposing a story upon them, but really kind of drawing out something that's perhaps unspoken and unrealized, not entirely conscious on the client's part. So that's when I would use something like that, just to help them think, you know what, really that's kind of acting coaching, where you're just saying, you're stuck on this idea that this person is just like a brute, or is just like but you're missing how vulnerable they are. Mm-hmm. That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, okay. I think we should probably wrap up here. This has been a fun conversation. I'd like to continue it at some point in the future. I think it's very helpful, and the back and forth. You're a great scene partner.
Same.
Thanks. And your direction was good too. So maybe what we could do is like set something up in the future. I'd like to have you come back and maybe talk about your book about modern brides and grooms at some point.
Oh, I would love that.
Or anything else. Do you have any seminars coming up or workshops, and how can people contact you?
I do. I twice a year, I give online workshops with a company called CEU, and social workers can get CE credit, continuing ed for that. And in June, I will be in LA for the International Association of Relational Psychoanalysts and Psychotherapists.
Excellent.
They're having a huge conference that's been delayed for 2 years. And I'm doing a pre-conference. So it's one of a few just like pre-conference workshops with the therapists there.
I like doing those kind of workshops for people because they're eager, they're not burnt out, they're not like they're not carrying bags of paper and they're not confused. They
want to be there.
They don't blow you. They don't ghost you for coffee with friends they haven't seen for 50 years.
Exactly.
They're very alive and alert and attuned. That sounds like it'll be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Maybe you can do something with APA, maybe, or because psychologists probably need this too. Maybe social workers.
I'd love to.
Yeah. Don't skimp out on a psychologist now.
Well, my email, nice segue to my email, which is markoconnelltherapist@gmail.com. And my website is just markoconnelltherapist.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here, Mark. The book is, everyone. Goodness, where is it? My notes. The book is, I'm not prepared. The book is The Performing Art of Therapy, and it is available from Routledge Press. So check it out. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Had a great time.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Psychology Talk podcast. Did you know you can find us on the web all over the place? Well, maybe not all over the place, but you can find us on Instagram, you can find us on Facebook, you can find us at Spreaker, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, loads of places. Please look for us, and if you can, subscribe, like us, leave us a review, send us a comment, a criticism. Hey, we like to hear a lot from people. Go ahead, talk to us. That's why we're here. By the way, this is just a reminder to let you know that all of the material here is for entertainment and informative purposes only. If you do need a therapist or a mental health professional, please seek one out. Music is provided by the band Serenati.